Welcome to PolkaWorld Interview. This is Kristen. How are you holding your DOT? You are using them for staking or for crowd loan? Do you know that there's a better way for you to hold DOT? In this episode, we're going to talk about the DDOT, a better way for you to hold your DOT. Welcome, Sushant. Firstly, let's start with a brief introduction of yourself and your project.
Sure. So I'm from, I guess, the startup world. I've had my own startup that I raised money for, and I've worked in lots of other startups. And so I'm a really big fan of, how startups work. It's very chaotic and you have to learn new things all the time. I got interested in crypto maybe in 2017, but took it seriously in 2020, and then became very interested in Polkadot and Kusama and just, what they were building. And so I actually started working at the Akala network early 2022, so last year. And then towards the end of the year, I moved on to Tapio. And so what Tapio is basically it's basically the better way to hold DOT. That's kind of how we like to portray it, but more specifically, it's a synthetic DOT asset which maintains a peg against DOT. And what that means is it's actually made up of different assets, which could be native DOT, staking DOT derivatives like L dot on Akala, or crowd loan derivatives like LC DOT. And the way it works, it's basically powered by this thing called a stable asset system, which is made up of the stable asset palette, which allows you to mint T dot, using a liquidity pool of different derivatives, and then the stable swap mechanism, which basically enables the swap mechanism between the underlying assets.
And I checked a little bit of your LinkedIn profile. The introduction is very interesting. You said that my time is spent between crypto and indoor farming.
Yes. Yeah, as I spend a lot of time working on hydroponics, so vertical farming indoors, so you don't have to use any soil, you just use water, light, and nutrients. And that's just something I'm passionate about, and something I kind of work on the side when I have free time.
Okay. And 1 year before you were in Akala, and then you were in Tapio. It's a leap forward.
Yes, definitely.
Mm.
Before Akala, I didn't know about Tapio, but because Tapio and Akala have such a close relationship, I was actually able to work with, Terry and Daniel, the co-founders of Tapio, while I was at Akala. And, that's how I learned what a great team they are, and what they're working on is really interesting.
As you already mentioned, that Tapio introduces TDOT, offering users a better way to hold DOT. And so,
Yes.
So what is TDOT? You mentioned a little bit, but
Sure.
please detail us a little bit in this part, especially how it works and why it is a better way.
Sure. So T-Dot, basically how you would get T-Dot, I'll start there, is that you would have, say, you would have native DOT, so the regular DOT token, and then you would have a derivative. For example, there's actually lots of derivatives in the Polkadot ecosystem. You have VS dot, you have XC dot, and then of course, you have L dot on Akala. And so the way it would work is you would get your L dot and you would get your native dot, put it into a T dot liquidity pool, and then you would receive T dot in exchange. And so why that's interesting is that this T dot that you receive, you can hold it just like you would regular dot. So it's very stable. You can redeem it back for dot or L dot whenever you like. But the interesting part is that all of a sudden, by holding T dot, you actually gain access to yield from the underlying assets. So one would be the staking portion. So if you're aware of L dot or liquid stake dot, it generates yield constantly. And so that yield is actually absorbed by T dot, and you get access to that. But then on top of that, because the pool is between dot and L dot, the fees that are generated by the pool, you also get those that fees as well. And so this way, you're holding dot, which is very liquid. You can turn it back into dot anytime you like, but then you're also able to get really good yield on that dot, which you might not be able to get if you're holding regular dot. Because if you were to hold regular dot, the only way for you to get yield would be to stake it on the relay chain, which is good. But the problem with that is if you want to unstake, it takes 28 days for you to get your dot back. And so that's kind of where T dot comes in.
Okay, and T dot generates sustainable yield from underlying derivatives, protocol fees, and token incentives. How
Yes.
sustainable the T DOT yield is?
Sure. So TIDO is actually very unique versus other, yield farming or LP pools or other staked assets because we actually don't rely on any token emissions. So normally, maybe personally, if you were to go yield farming or contribute to an LP pool on a DEX or something, the yield you would receive would often be tokens from the protocol. So it's basically, printing more tokens to give to you as a reward. So TDOT doesn't need to do that at all. There's no token emissions. Instead, the yield from TDOT is actually, it's more like revenue. And it comes from four places. Number one is these liquid staking rewards that I mentioned earlier. So the L dot component of T dot, that of course generates rewards constantly. And then you have swap fees. So if I was to swap dot for L dot or L dot for dot, that swap would have a fee and that gets collected by T dot. On top of that, we have redemptions. So whenever you would say, let's say you have T dot and you want to convert it back into dot, you can do that. And that actual redemption you'll have to pay a fee that's collected by the pool. And then finally, the instant unstaking mechanism of L dot. So if you're familiar with liquid staking on Akala, like I mentioned earlier, if you were to unstake dot, you could either wait the 28 days unbonding period, or you could actually instantly unstake by paying a small fee and you instantly get your dot back. And so that process of instantly unstaking L dot, that's actually facilitated by T dot. And so the fee you pay gets collected by the pool. And so all these four fees, once collected, they get paid out to T dot holders every week.
T dot is on the top of dot derivatives. While the market cap of dot is currently 5 billion. So will that be the cap for the D dot?
That's a good question. It's a nice thing to think about. Eventually T dot hopefully will be, in the billions to 5 billion, but it's not really our goal or priority. We don't really want to replace the dot token or, remove its utility. We want to instead support dot by making its liquidity, very easily accessible, as well as usable. And so, while we'd love to have a lot of that dot liquidity within T dot, there's still going to be reasons to want to also hold regular dot, which is why one of our talking points is that you're able to remain liquid and able to easily convert your T dot back into dot. So for example, if there's a Polkadot governance vote, we don't see, and I personally don't see, Parity, the team behind Polkadot, changing the token you need to use to actually vote, which is of course dot. And so if you had T dot and you wanted to vote on a governance referendum, you would have to convert it back from T dot into dot and then go ahead and vote. So the vision for us is, of course, it'd be really good to have the same market cap as dot, but what we're concerned about is, the idea of a rising tide lifts all boats. And so as we support and, grow the Polkadot ecosystem and it gets more TVL and users, then T dot itself will get a lot of those TVL and users.
Usually the derivative market is 10 times larger than the spot market. How, in this perspective, how do you foresee the future of a T dot market cap?
Sure. So on the derivatives point, because how our whole idea is kind of, putting all of these derivatives underneath T dot, what we want to actually retain is that you're able to access these derivatives a lot more easily. So the idea would be if you wanted to use a specific derivative on, say, a Kala, you would have T dot, but not necessarily using T dot on a Kala. So the idea would be you would have access to T dot and then redeem that T dot, for one of the derivatives, which you can then use on a Kala. And so because all these different parachains have their own derivatives with their own utilities, we want to make it easier between chains to access them. Because, if you have a derivative on Moonbeam and a derivative on a Kala, there might not be use for both of them on both chains. But if they're both on the T dot, then it doesn't matter which chain you're on, you can access T dot and get access to those derivatives. So, as time goes on, we'd like to have all these derivatives under T dot, but until the time comes where the derivatives market of dot goes above dot, because currently, eventually it might get there, but it's still finding its way right now, then, T dot could really grow. But until that happens, I think our biggest priority is less market cap and more making sure this works and helping everyone. because once T dot is on every parachain, every application is using it, then the sky's the limit. The market cap can just go to the moon because everyone is putting their derivatives into T dot.
Okay, focus on the small use cases in the beginning, and could you unfold that how can TDOT helps a project?
Sure. So like I mentioned, you have all these derivatives on all these different chains, and it's really fragmenting, the dot liquidity. Instead of all these parachains, collaborating and working together, they're kind of competing for that dot. I want this much dot, and they want that dot, and they convert it to whatever derivative. And so if you're an application builder, something that could happen is that it's very hard for you to integrate all of these different assets because you want to attract as many people as possible, as much TVL as possible. So you want to support all these different derivatives, but there's so many of them. So it'll be a very big job for you. And then on top of that, not only do you have to integrate the assets, but then you might also need to have liquidity pools for those assets. And so all of a sudden it's, there's all these problems that you have to sort out first, before you can even do whatever it is you're trying to do. And so with T dot, instead of getting all these different assets, you can instead integrate just T dot. So you only have to integrate the one asset, and all of a sudden, if T dot has all of these derivatives underneath it, you can get access to that liquidity whenever you like, with just T dot. And instead of having all of these liquidity pools with all these random assets, you could instead just have one or two pools just using T dot. And so all of a sudden, all the liquidity you want will just be consolidated, just within T dot. And then eventually, when Tapio's governance goes online, you might be also able to put forward proposals to bootstrap your liquidity. So for example, in a parachain or even with the Polkadot treasury, if you're a project that needs liquidity, you can put forward a proposal, explain to the community why it's a good idea to share some of that liquidity with the project, and then they can use it to build themselves further. And eventually, hopefully, Tapio has the same sort of mechanism.
The Akala AUSD issue was by far the most significant event happened in the Osama ecosystem. The whole network even paused during that event. So as a project building on top of Akala, how does T dot reacted to the event?
Yeah, that's a good question. So to recap, basically what happened, of course, was there was an issue with one of Akala's liquidity pools. And what this allowed was users were able to mint AUSD, without using collateral. And then what this resulted in was you had all this AUSD that these bad actors had, and they wanted to get rid of it because of course they knew it wouldn't last forever. So they were swapping for other assets and then trying to take them off chain. And one of the assets they chose, of course, was DOT. Now, the issue for Tapio and T dot was that the T dot pool is what held all the DOT, because whenever you'd want to trade your DOT for something else, it would go through the T dot pool. And so as these bad actors were swapping the AUSD for DOT, that DOT was being drained from the T dot pool. And so at its lowest, the composition of T dot, we like to keep it between 30 to 40% DOT and the rest is L dot. During the issue, it went down to 2% DOT and 98% L dot, which, as you can tell, is very, very skewed. But the good thing is the underlying mechanism behind T dot kept working. And so I mentioned the stable swap mechanism earlier. So what the problem it had was, how do I keep more DOT in the pool, but get rid of some L dot? And the way it did that was it put a discount on L dot and it put a premium on DOT. So very, very simply, it became a lot cheaper to get L dot and a lot more expensive to get DOT. And basically at the peak, what you could do is you could actually deposit DOT and then withdraw a lot more L dot in return. So for example, you could swap one DOT and you would get like 1.4 DOT worth of L dot in return. So, right like that, 40% profit. It was a very attractive arbitrage opportunity. And so you had all of these users that were, putting their DOT into the pool to pull out L dot at a profit. And so very quickly, the composition started to recover because there was more and more DOT going into the pool. And within 6 hours of that happening, DOT was around 20% and 80% L dot, which obviously isn't ideal, but it was a lot healthier than it was before. And during this entire time, T-Dot didn't break, it didn't stop working, it didn't stop facilitating trades. It kept working as designed. As is, if you go to our GitHub, this is what's meant to happen during a time like this, and it happened perfectly. If you'd like to actually read more on this, I wrote an article on this AUSD issue where I documented it from start to finish, using a lot of the data from our dashboard. So we're really about not having to trust people or not having to listen and believe them. You can actually verify this data. So if you go to the Tapio DApp, you can go to the dashboard and you can see, the pool in real time, see what the composition is, see how much revenue it's generating. So I feel anyone who is interested in Tito or Tapio should not only read that article, but also, check out the dashboard when they have free time.
So I think, so our next topic is that how does Substrate or Polkadot empowers T-Dot in a way that any other blockchains are not capable of?
Sure. So there's quite a lot of things we enjoy and we really like about Substrate and Polkadot, more than other chains. Right off the top of my head, of course, is the concept of XCM. Because normally on regular blockchains, if you were to bridge from one to the other, you'll often have to rely on a third-party bridge to facilitate that, which of course, introduces its own protocol risk. But then on top of that, you might also have to wrap your tokens in order to have to use them on the destination chain, which is, the fragmentation of liquidity issue we're trying to address all over again, because now you have a different version of the same asset. With XCM, of course, it's, there's no bridge involved. It's a straight transfer, and there's no compromise on security because, it's a fundamental part of Polkadot. But on that question, I think a better way, I guess, to answer it is that, Tapio and T-Dot weren't products or projects that we built and then we were looking for a home. We didn't create them and start going through a list of parachains and, look at the pros and cons and decide on Polkadot. Instead, we were very big fans of Polkadot, both from a technical perspective, but also as just a regular user. And it became clear, this was going to become a problem with how the infrastructure worked with the parachain model. It became obvious that the fundamental dot liquidity, which is, the blood of the entire ecosystem, was going to become more and more fragmented and siloed. And so this is kind of what inspired us to begin working on this and to develop a solution that would help the entire Polkadot ecosystem as it grows. At the time when we started, it might not have been the biggest problem in the world, but, we could just extrapolate, look in the future 3, 4, 5 years. And let's say all of a sudden there's a lot more retail and corporate attention. There's 10, 20, 50 times the TVL, millions of daily users. Then this fragmentation of liquidity issue would, be everywhere because you have all these assets that have their own little uses on all these different chains. And so rather than addressing it when it becomes a big problem and have all these band-aid fixes, we decided we'd rather fix the problem now and grow alongside and support the ecosystem. So hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, and Tapio make a lot of development already. Is there any big things coming to Tapio for 2027? To 2020, 2023.
Yeah, hopefully we're still around in 2027. But a big push for 2023 would be liquidity. So we know T-Dot works. We know it fixes a problem with all these derivatives. So our biggest focus now is making sure the TVL of T-Dot keeps increasing. And one of our focuses for that is actually institutional liquidity. So something that some people might not know is DOT is actually the most held asset by corporate enterprise institutional investors, so like VCs, hedge funds, etc. More than Bitcoin or Ethereum. And so that DOT that they're holding is not doing anything. It's sitting in a wallet. Maybe it's staked on the relay chain, but often it's not. And so our big priority is getting all that DOT liquidity within T-Dot, because not only are they still able to hold DOT because they see DOT growing in the future, but they're able to get a lot better yield on that DOT. On top of that, we might also be submitting some proposals for the Polkadot Treasury ourselves. Again, there's like tens of millions of DOT there. And because network activity, in all of crypto, but obviously in Polkadot as well, has slowed down, this is a really good time for us to leverage that. At the end of last year, actually, we received our second Web3 grant. And what that Web3 grant was about was it basically enabled the stable asset palette to become XCM enabled. So all of a sudden, you can mint TDOT on other chains, you can redeem TDOT on other chains, but eventually, we'll be incorporating other derivatives on other chains into TDOT. And so that's kind of going to be one of our focuses to make TDOT multi-chain during 2023. On top of that, we do have some ideas of, we think this is a very valuable product for the ecosystem. And so we're thinking of a common good approach. And, that could take place in many ways. It could be a parachain, it could be a parathread, or even maybe we get integrated directly into Statement. So Statement, of course, is the asset registration parachain within Polkadot. So it makes sense that TDOT, would be there to be minted and redeemed as well. So those are a few ideas we have for 2023.
Great. And as our interview drawing to the end, anything you would like to add or remark?
No, but I would just say that we've got a lot of updates and a lot of progress in 2023 for sure. Big things are coming.
Okay, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's all for our interview, and we learned a lot about Tapio. Hope our community loves your project, and let's work together to build the Polkadot ecosystem together.
Yes, definitely. Good speaking with you.